The fall of Constantinople and the rise of the Ottoman Turks. And really, to some extent, what we're trying to do is encapsulate several hundred years of historical development into a single moment, that is, the fall of Constantinople in 1453. To the Ottoman Turks. Now, the fall of Constantinople itself is sort of symbolized in this image that you have here before yourself. I'm proud of this image because I took this picture myself last year. I don't know, it's kind of amateurish, but I like it. This is the central dome of Hagia Sophia, the greatest Christian church ever built. And as you can see, it's dilapidated. The mosaics are in relatively poor condition. This is a building, of course, where you can see the Islamic scroll work on the top of the dome, and you can see evidence of the fact that this building was used as a mosque for hundreds of years. Hagia Sophia in many ways symbolizes the evolution of the city of Constantinople itself over the course of several hundred years, as Hagia Sophia evolved from church to mosque and then, of course, to museum as Turkey attempted to secularize itself in the 20th century. But what we're going to try to do today is really historically contextualize the background to the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, because this is an event of a magnitude that's very, very hard for modern people to grasp. It's really hard for us to imagine for the medieval psyche, for Byzantines, for Westerners, and for the Turks themselves, how big of a deal it was when the Byzantine Empire finally fell. The city itself, in the minds of Byzantines, and for that matter in the minds of Westerners, the city itself was protected by a couple of different things. It was protected first of all by these monumental Theodosian walls that you see here in an artist's representation of the siege. The Theodosian land walls had been built by the official Anthemias in the time of Theodosius II in the 5th century. They are monumental work of engineering. If you go to Istanbul today, you cannot miss them. You can't possibly miss them. In fact, you have to go through them when you take the tram from the airport into the old city. And you really get a sense of what it would have been like to besiege the city. But more importantly than the walls, much more importantly than the walls, the city of Constantinople was protected by the Mother of God. And here you have a mosaic from Hagia Sophia itself, which I also took this picture, and I didn't have proper equipment, which is why it's kind of angled from the bottom. But what you're looking at in this picture is the symbol of the Mother of God, the Holy Theotokos, the Ever-Virgin Mary, being presented with two gifts by two emperors. On the right you have the Emperor Constantine presenting the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, with the city of Constantinople. On the left you have the Emperor Justinian presenting the Mother of God with the Basilica, with Hagia Sophia, which was rebuilt in Justinian's reign. The notion that the city of Constantinople was really protected by the Theotokos, much more so than by the walls, is something that's a major part of Byzantine lore. It was a major part of the Byzantine psyche all throughout the Middle Ages. The city of Constantinople survived sieges throughout its history by armies upwards of 100,000 or even 200,000 men. It survived sieges by Slavs and Avars, by Arabs and Turks. The city of Constantinople withstood many, many different sieges, palace coups and civil wars. Generally speaking, civil wars were the only things that could cause Constantinople to be conquered. Even the Fourth Crusade to some extent was the product of a civil war. But leaving that aside, the walls of Constantinople had never really truly been breached by an external enemy, by an enemy who didn't have some kind of allies within, ever in its history. The city was protected by the Theotokos. And so when the city of Constantinople fell, and it fell in part, as you see here, of course, due to the artillery of the Turks, when the city fell, it was not only the end of an era, it was something that kind of shattered the religious psyche of Byzantines and of Westerners. It was something that brought about tremendous soul-searching. And for the Ottoman Turks, it vindicated their imperial project. The project of empire building that the Ottomans saw themselves as being engaged in was in their minds vindicated by their success in besieging this city. So what we're going to do is take a look at this event and its context. And the event in itself is sort of simple to say. Just before dawn, on the 29th of May, 1453, it was the Turkish Sultan Mehmed II. He had been besieging Constantinople for months, and he ordered the assault that would bring an end to over 1,000 years of Christian history at Constantinople. And institutionally, it would bring an end to over 2,000 years of Roman history. The ancient Roman state, of course, having been transformed over the centuries into a Christian empire. And it survived in the Greek East long after it had fallen elsewhere, including in the Latin West. So you have this ancient state that finally meets its doom. And if we're going to come to understand how this catastrophe could happen, we're going to have to understand several hundred years of history leading up to it. How this catastrophe comes to befall the East Roman or Byzantine Empire in 1453 is something that it's going to take a lot of background work to really come to grips with. The significance of this event for both Western and Near Eastern history is also a topic that we're going to deal with over the next couple of talks. We have to understand not only what brought this event about, but then what this event meant for the Turkish world, for the Islamic world, for the Western world, and for the world of Eastern Christianity. So we're going to have to deal with a few different things. First of all, these questions. How did these events come to pass? Second of all, what was their significance? When we're dealing with these questions, we're going to come up against this idea. It's a major part of the Greek Orthodox psyche to this day. That the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453 was the fall of the West. And it's bizarre, it's counterintuitive, but it's something that Greek school children have been taught at least since the age of Greek nationalism in the 19th century. The 19th century brought about tremendous changes in terms of how Greeks visualize themselves as a nation, as it did for that matter for the rest of Europe. And so it's really in the 19th century that you see this view becoming popular among Greeks. That the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, the destruction of the Byzantine Empire, was actually something that was the fault of the West. And this picture kind of tells it all. This is a picture of Greek monks, Orthodox Greek monks, protesting the visit of John Paul II, St. John Paul II, to Greece in 2001. They're holding up a sign that says, Antichrist, Pope, get out of Orthodox Greece. And this is mild compared to many of the signs that were held up. One that I love is this one. You see it in the background, Papa persona non grata. Trying to throw together their Latin, Italian, whatever it's supposed to be. But you know, this is, well, it's kind of awkward too, because a Greek priest is also called a Papa. So you have to watch out there. But anyway, Papa persona non grata, you know what these guys are trying to say, right? And looking at this picture, it's visually jarring for Christians, especially in the West, to see something like this. Because you look at these guys and you say to yourself, this isn't Hamas, this isn't Hezbollah, these are not Muslims, these are Orthodox Greek monks. And that's jarring to people. And so actually it's important for us as part of Catholic adult education to confront this view, to determine whether or not there's any merit to it. And in order to do so, we really have to look at Byzantine political history. And this is going to be kind of the bulk of the heavy lifting that we're going to try to do tonight. Because the fact of the matter is that this view here, the idea that the fall of Constantinople, the fall of the Byzantine Empire is the fault of the West. It's something that's so popular. It exists in kind of high and low versions of the theory, as it were. I think it's safe to say the high version of this theory that 1453 and the events of 1453 are the West's fault. The high version of it is what you find in something like, say, Stephen Runciman's History of the Crusades, or elsewhere. But Runciman is a great example because he's a great rhetorician. And when Runciman talks about the Fourth Crusade in 1204 and the significance of the Fourth Crusade, he says these 13th century crusaders, when they sacked Constantinople, they fatally weakened the Byzantine Empire. Even asserts if it weren't for the Crusaders' sack of Constantinople in 1204, the Byzantine Empire would have risen to new heights of strength and conquered all the Turks, etc., etc. It's sort of fanciful, I think, wishful thinking on Runciman's part. But really the idea that the 1204 Crusader conquest of Constantinople left a mortal wound on the Byzantine body politic is something that it has a kind of a long pedigree in 19th and 20th century historiography. And that's kind of the high version of the theory. The low version of the theory is more what you're seeing here with these monks, where they might have a somewhat vaguer understanding of Byzantine history, and they're saying to themselves, any association with Latins, any association with Westerners, it associates us with heretics, it brings down the wrath of God upon us. And in some very vague, very loose sense, they associate the fall of Constantinople to the Turks with the reunion councils of Lyon and Florence that happened in the 13th and 15th centuries respectively. So in other words, they say to themselves, wow, we know in a very vague sense, we know that back in the Middle Ages, we sort of consorted with Latins and we flirted with Latins as a people and then the Turks conquered us. And so there's got to be a connection there. It can't just be by accident that those two things happen. And so this theory, it's kind of an inchoate theory. If anything, it's more of a feeling than a theory when you're talking about people like these monks. But it's something that has wide currency among the Greeks, and it's something that we really have to confront. Now, at first blush, this theory is kind of odd to someone who's actually a student of Byzantine history. And it's odd for a variety of reasons. It's odd given the tens of thousands of Western soldiers and commanders who fought for the Byzantine Empire all through the period of Byzantium's decline from the 13th through the 15th century. It's especially odd given the frantic efforts of the papacy during this period to organize crusades to save Constantinople. But the real reason why we have to understand this theory to be wrong, it lies in the fact that we have a much better understanding of this than we used to. We have a much better understanding of Byzantine political history in the Paleologan period. Okay, and that's what we're going to try to address tonight, at least in part, at least. To scratch the surface, to give ourselves a sense if we're going to look for the causes of Byzantine decline. It's all too easy to say, well, the Fourth Crusade happened in 1204, and then 250 years later the Byzantine Empire fell. Bam, we got it. It's right there. That's too easy, it's too facile, and it's wrong. It's also all too easy to get superstitious the way the monks do and say, oh, if you flirt with Westerners, God will punish you or something like that. And even that theory, it sort of ignores the details of the fact that the more they flirted with Westerners, the better luck they had in this period anyway. So be all of that as it may. What we really have to look at is the details, the nitty-gritty of Byzantine political history. We're going to kind of get down in the weeds here and talk about the Paleologan dynasty. We also have to take a look to some extent at the history of the Islamic world during the centuries leading up to the 1453 siege. We really can't give a complete account of the events leading up to the siege without understanding the early history of the Ottoman dynasty, and really the nature of what had been happening to the Islamic world over the course of centuries leading up to 1453. How many of you saw Dinesh D'Souza's movie about Barack Obama, the 2016 movie? Yeah, a few of you, the fewer the better. I saw it, was not impressed with it frankly. The one error that I found to be really disturbing in Dinesh D'Souza's movie was the idea that the Islamic world is monolithic. The Islamic world is just one thing. He even asserts in this movie that the Islamic world is forming into the United States of Islam. He actually uses that expression and threatening to destroy the United States. This kind of view, obviously it's alarmist, there's a political agenda behind it. But anyone who's a student of Islamic history finds it laughable. The Islamic world has never been a monolithic entity, and the closest it ever came to being a monolithic entity was maybe during the Abbasid Golden Age, which was a long time ago. There's a lot of water under the bridge. A lot of water under the bridge since around the year 900. Let's put it that way. Okay, one of the things that had been happening to the Islamic world since around the year 900 was the immigration into the Islamic world of large numbers of people that we call Turks. Turk is a very generic, very general ethnographic term. We're talking about Central Asian nomads who are recruited as mercenaries. They became soldiers in the Abbasid Caliphate in the 10th century. Eventually, by the middle of the 10th century, the Turks were basically ruling the Islamic world. They came to rule the Islamic world in much the same way as Western barbarians came to rule the Roman Empire. You enter the empire, you become soldiers, you become enrolled in the service of the state, and eventually you subvert the state. That's kind of what happened to the Abbasid Caliphate. But the Turks themselves had a hard time grouping themselves into a functional empire or a functional state. It certainly wasn't the United Emirates of Islam or something like that. The Turkish world tended to be divided along tribal lines, along clan lines, along linguistic lines, and along historical lines based on circumstance, based on their service in the Islamic world. What we see as the Byzantine Empire weakens, and this is very oversimplified, very facile. But what we see is that after, say, the late 11th century, larger and larger numbers of Turks were able to move into Eastern Asia Minor, to move into Anatolia and threaten the Byzantine Empire directly. They weren't always politically united. Their fortunes tended to rise and fall based on whether or not they had a powerful emir to lead them at the time or something like that. But the rise of the Turks as a power within the Islamic world is something that we have to kind of have in the back of our minds. But anyway, in the meantime, let's take a look at Byzantine political history in the Paleologan period. We should have a map here. Oh, there we go. Hey, we got it. We're in business. Okay. So these are the three things that we're going to try to come to understand when we talk about the rise and fall of the Paleologan dynasty. We're going to talk about the achievements of the first Paleologan emperor, Michael VIII, the catastrophic failures of his son, Andronicus II, and then the terrible Byzantine Civil War of 1341 to 1347. We're going to try to keep names to an absolute minimum. I promise you. The problem with doing Byzantine history is that everybody has the same name. Anyone who's not named George is named Michael or Andronicus. And it gets really, really problematic sometimes, especially when you have John V, who's having a civil war with John VI early in his reign. And then later in his reign, he has a civil war with John VII. And so it gets a little bit confusing. The fact that John V reigned after John VI died, never mind. It's all ridiculous. So we'll try to keep it under control as far as names go. But first, we'll start with Michael VIII and his achievements. Bam, there we go. Everybody see the map? Sorry about this map. It's taken from an old historical atlas. But in any event, to understand Michael VIII, we have to point out a few different things. Who was Michael VIII? Michael VIII was the Byzantine military leader who retook Constantinople from the Latins in 1261. That was his first major achievement. He was the regent, actually, for the young Prince John IV Lascaris. John IV was an emperor of a splinter state that had been created when Byzantium fell apart in the 13th century. Michael VIII's achievement was as regent for young John IV to retake the capital, to retake the city of cities, Constantinople, and to turn it back into a functioning imperial capital. To some extent, the way in which Michael VIII was able to be a successful emperor and a successful leader, it was due in part to the fact that he was importing functional institutions. He was importing a functional bureaucracy and a functional military from Asia Minor, from Nicaea, where they had lived in exile during the Latin occupation of Byzantium. Michael VIII was a guy as regent for the young prince who showed himself to be alert. He showed himself to be very persuasive, very skilled as a ruler and a commander, and of course ruthless. His first ruthless act is what occurs right after he retakes Constantinople for the Lascaris dynasty, which is he takes the young emperor that he's regent for, and he blinds him with hot pokers. Now, you have to do that if you're going to start your own dynasty. Now, this is a problem for Michael VIII because it gets him excommunicated. Being excommunicated is a little bit of a problem for him. It's not as much of a problem as it would be for you and me because when you're a Byzantine emperor, you can fire the patriarch who excommunicates you. He ends up doing that. He ends up simply firing the patriarch who excommunicated him, appointing another patriarch, whom he would later fire. But it's off to a little bit of a rocky start in terms of Michael VIII's relationship with the Church. But politically speaking and militarily speaking, Michael VIII was a very, very strong leader. During the course of his reign, from 1261 to 1282, he was able to achieve military victories on several different fronts. I think we can identify, at least Warren Treadgold identifies, 6 different military fronts on which Michael VIII was fighting. The first one is up here in the north. See if we can get the pointy thing here. Here we have the Serbs and the Bulgars who, although they were Byzantine Christians themselves, they were enemies of the empire. They liked to take advantage of the empire's weakness. At various times, they even had ambitions of conquering Constantinople themselves. Michael VIII was able to take a very firm stand against the Serbs and the Bulgars, win very important victories that secured the frontier there. Michael VIII was also able to win some important victories here in the south of Greece, where you see the Duchy of Achaia. These are leftover French crusaders who have a kind of an independent state that they rule there. It's sort of a motley, weakly organized feudal Latin state in the south of Greece. Michael VIII was able to win some important victories against these guys at various times. Take the leaders prisoner and force concessions from them, etc. He also won important victories against the Venetians. Here in the Aegean Sea, generally speaking, he was able to expel the Venetians from some important islands and assert Byzantine naval supremacy in the Aegean Sea, which is very, very important. Michael VIII also won important victories against the Turks. This is why you see here by 1265, the Byzantine frontier being restored all the way out here in Anatolia. These cities like Nicomedia, cities like Bursa, also known as Bursa, Philadelphia, Laodicea. These cities at various times over the course of a couple hundred years were sacked by the Turks. And so to push the frontier out more towards the plateau, it's a very big achievement for Michael VIII. Very importantly, Michael VIII won victories against Byzantine splinter states and rebels. Particularly here, where you see the Despotate of Epirus in the Western Balkans, I guess you could say. This despotate was a splinter state that had arisen early in the 13th century. Michael VIII was basically able to turn them into vassals of the empire. Most importantly though, see that was 5, the 6th front on which Michael VIII wins important victories is against Charles of Angia. Now Charles of Angia, a very, very significant figure in terms of 13th century power politics. Charles of Angia was a younger brother of Saint Louis IX of France, of course. Charles of Angia was a man of tremendous ambition. He wanted to rule Sicily for himself. And after 1261, Charles of Angia had ambitions of reconquering Constantinople for the Latins. So now, if you're going to reconquer Constantinople for the Latins and you're Charles of Angia, what do you try to get the Pope to agree to? What do you try to get the Pope to endorse? A crusade, right? Because having the Pope call it a crusade, that's actually the best way for Charles of Angia to recruit soldiers. He can't recruit soldiers on the basis of his financial resources or on the basis of his feudal authority. But he could theoretically recruit soldiers if the Pope called a crusade. Now if you're Michael VIII Speleologus, do you want a crusade? No. So if you're Michael VIII, what's the best way to prevent a crusade from happening? Reunite the churches and the schism. And then there can't be a crusade. It's a fantastic idea. So Michael VIII is sitting there and he's saying, well, this one's easy, right? We just reunite the churches and the schism. And he had a friendly Pope in Gregory X, who was open to this idea. The only problem for Michael VIII was that most of his clergy were not open to the idea. This is where he has to fire his second page regard, actually. And I've actually read Michael VIII's speech to the clergy on the subject of this union with the Western Church. It's actually a fascinating exposition of the Byzantine religious principle of economy. Economia is a religious principle that is very unfamiliar to Westerners. There's really no analog for it in Catholicism, or in Protestantism for that matter. It's a principle that we're not really familiar with in the West. But economy, it's basically a rough way of getting around practical difficulties when morality seems to be getting in your way. Economy, it's a way of saying, well, the rules say this, but under the circumstances. If it's a big enough deal, you could kind of make it strong enough, or we'll just do that. And I don't mean to trivialize it. That's basically what Michael VIII says, right, in his speeches to his clergy, where he's trying to persuade them to go along with a union with the Western Church. He says, it's economy. We all know that this union is not necessarily desirable. But you got to play ball, and if you can't beat him, join him. And so we're going to have a union of churches. He couldn't really get any senior clerics to go along with this. So he ended up sending a delegation of senior imperial officials on the one hand, and junior bishops on the other hand, who went to Lyon in France in 1274, and attended the famous Council of Lyon in 1274, where they signed on to a union of the churches. Now, this is a union in 1274 that we have to analyze it in a couple of different ways from Michael VIII. On the one hand, as a union with the Western Church, it very much helped Michael VIII's foreign policy. It forced all the crusade from Charles of Anjou. It bought him some precious time to strengthen Byzantine imperial institutions, to strengthen the Byzantine army. It allowed Michael VIII to basically not have to worry about his most dangerous foe, which would have been Charles of Anjou. On the other hand, it does cause the beginnings of splinterings within the Byzantine Church, within the clergy of the empire, especially the upper clergy. You have a couple of schisms that arise as a result of Michael VIII's unionist policy, as it were, and what it causes, to simplify it as much as we can. What it causes basically is the division of the Byzantine Church into pro-union and anti-union factions. And these factions, over the course of the next couple hundred years, are going to develop polemics against one another. They're going to develop bitter hatred of one another. They're going to call each other heretics. And when the Turks end up conquering Constantinople in 1453, it's a no-brainer for them which faction they're going to put in power. It's absolutely a no-brainer for them to put the anti-union, the most savage anti-Latin polemicists that they can find, in charge of the Byzantine Church. And so, to some extent, the permanence of that anti-Latin outlook within Byzantine Christianity, it's really due to the Turkish conquest of Constantinople. Certainly in the Middle Ages, the anti-unionist position was not the only position in the Byzantine Church. Its permanence, in part, we're going to see as due to the success of the Turks. Now, be that as it may, I think we can make one final point here about Michael VIII, and that is in reference to the historiographical position that we enunciated before about why were the Turks able to conquer Constantinople in 1453? And was it the fault of the Latins? Was it due to the Fourth Crusade that they were able to do this? And we said, no, we're going to show that that's wrong. I think one step towards showing that that's wrong is when you point out that the empire of Michael VIII was far stronger, far more powerful, far wealthier, and far more secure than was the Byzantine Empire that the Crusaders had conquered. The 12th century empire, the late 12th century empire, the Empire of the Angeli, was a Byzantine empire that was incredibly weak. It had been impoverished by a rash of rebellions. Its treasury had been emptied, and its own political dissensions were what had invited the Crusaders to the capital in the first place. The Byzantine Empire, by the end of Michael VIII's reign, is relatively speaking secure, militarily and politically united, with a treasury that, if not overflowing, if not bursting at the seams, the treasury and the budget seemed at least to be able to deal with immediate challenges. Let's put it down. And so if you look at Byzantine imperial institutions by 1282, there's a strength there that you didn't see, say, a century earlier, and then right before Michael VIII's death. I think he died of happiness when this happened. But the Sicilian Vespers actually kicked Charles Avon's out of Sicily. And so Charles Avon's has a viable Mediterranean political player. He's done after the Sicilian Vespers. No more worrying about Charles Avon's. In fact, it's pretty clear that Michael VIII actually paid the guys who staged the Sicilian Vespers, which, oh, good move, hats off to him for that. Anyway, so what we see here is Michael VIII's son, Andronicus II. He's going to inherit an empire that was stronger than it had ever been in recent memory, with fewer and more humble enemies. And Andronicus II would make some disastrous decisions that would have serious consequences for the Byzantine Empire. So remember, Andronicus II's reign is 1282 to 1328. So what did Andronicus II do? Why were his decisions so disastrous? Well, number one, he repudiated the Union of Lyon. Which, to some extent, makes sense. The repudiation of the Union of Lyon, based on the internal circumstances of the Byzantine Empire at the time, there were very few high-ranking Byzantines who ever liked it anyway. Even the papacy wasn't too hot on the Union of Lyon. After they realized how the percentage of the Byzantine clergy that rejected it was so high. And in fact, Michael VIII had ended his life as a man excommunicated by the papacy, for a variety of other reasons. And so he was on double-secret excommunication. Because, anyway, the Union of Lyon, Andronicus decides. This is basically a dead letter. And we can't really blame him for that as harshly as we might want to. Because, on the one hand, we can say with hindsight becomes wisdom. We can say the Union of Lyon was very, very hard to make happen. It's very, very easy to dissolve. Restoring it would be well nigh impossible. So you want to try to salvage it as long as you can. And that had been Michael VIII's policy. Michael VIII was sort of holding out for changes in papal attitudes. Changes in the attitudes of his own clergy. So that he could somehow salvage this extremely fragile Union of Lyon. Andronicus decided that it wasn't worth salvaging. And maybe it's in part because the empire that he inherited was so strong. It's a decision that to some extent made sense. So he repudiates the Union of Lyon. This is going to cause him problems in his relations with the West. It's going to cause him serious problems. He also made a decision that I think from a practical point of view, from a worldly point of view, is even worse, which is he decided that it would be a good idea to dismantle the Byzantine navy. Now, it sounds weird. Why would he dismantle the Byzantine navy? Why would you do that? Andronicus II was one of these guys who just really didn't grasp the fundamentals of fiscal responsibility. He looked around for things to cut from the budget. And he thought, oh, navy, we don't really need a navy. Why do we not need a navy? Well, because we have the Genoese. The Genoese occupy the quarter of Galata, just north of the city of Constantinople. The Genoese are an ally that we can rely on. They're a very strong naval power. The Genoese are able to keep the Venetians in check, maybe. And we can sort of make deals with them, rely on them as our navy. No need for us to have this huge chunk of our budget going towards the maintenance of a navy. Boats are expensive. Ships are expensive. Paying people is expensive. Giving people land grants to pay their salaries. That's expensive. So he goes here. We can slash the budget. Dismantles the Byzantine navy. That's going to be a disaster. That's going to be an absolute disaster for him. The other thing that he tries to do is he tries to save money by, instead of recruiting Byzantine soldiers, which involves using land grants to pay their salaries, he recruits foreign mercenaries. Now, this is going to weaken Byzantium. It's going to result in the loss of lands, because the army is necessarily going to be smaller. And then the loss of lands is going to reduce income, thus undermining his savings. But the real problem with the foreign mercenaries that he recruits is that they tend to be very hard to control. When you recruit foreign mercenaries who don't have imperial interests at stake, they tend to sack things. They tend to burn cities and go around burning crops and attacking people. It's just not good. And they're just flat out not as reliable as soldiers. And we see this really very early in his reign. He starts struggling with his mercenaries. Finally, in 1301, a group of Byzantine mercenaries were defeated here by the Emir Osman. Now Osman, of course, is the guy that we encounter who is the father and progenitor of the Ottoman dynasty. Osman was the first of the Ottomans. Now, if you look at this map in the year 1300, Osman state, the area that he controls, this little nation to Ottoman state, it appears to be small. It appears to be one of several different emirates in Anatolia, all of which were sort of vassals to the Mongols, or in some of them were at various times vassals to the Byzantines. So you say to yourself, Osman, not a huge threat. And yet, due to demographic and financial realities in the Islamic world, the ability of these chiefs, these emirs in Anatolia, to recruit soldiers from elsewhere in the Islamic world, is about to be very much on the rise. These guys are going to have the opportunity to recruit large numbers of soldiers from the Eastern Islamic world, soldiers who are either fleeing from the Mongols, who are defeated by the Mongols, or who belonged in the service of various emirs and chiefs who were defeated by the Mongols. Basically, the rise of the Mongols is going to cause a flood of just loose Turks and Islamic soldiers who have nothing to do and are willing to come and take service with these emirs here in Anatolia. Osman is one of them. His descendants are going to go on to have by far the greatest success of any of these dynasties. In fact, we can see in 1301 the empire acquiring a very, very dangerous enemy. In the immediate, though, here in the first decade of the 14th century, it looked like the biggest threat to Byzantine security was these stupid mercenaries that they kept bringing in. Probably most infamous group of mercenaries that Andronicus II brought in were called the Catalan Grand Company. They were sort of these traveling Mediterranean adventurers. They were commanded by a guy named Roger de Flor. And they heard that there might be some good opportunities to make money by going and fighting for the Byzantine. So Roger de Flor sent a message. Hey, Andronicus, I hear you're hiring soldiers. Andronicus said, yeah, what do you charge? They said, oh, it's not that much. But it's 3 times what you're paying all your other mercenaries, but you can afford it. Andronicus signed the deal. Of course, he couldn't afford it. In fact, what he agreed to pay the Catalan Grand Company, it exceeded the entirety of the Byzantine imperial budget. And it was an absolute disaster. I don't know what he thought he was doing. Because once you get the Catalan Grand Company there, in the Byzantine Empire, you can't get rid of them. And then when you can't pay them, and they get mad, they decide to pay themselves. And they go on a kind of a 7-year-long rampage. They ended up landing in Greece down here. Kind of in this purple area, around 1310, is where the Catalan Grand Company ended up settling. They liked it, it was a nice countryside. And then we sort of lose track of them at that point. Andronicus II also experimented with hiring Turkish mercenaries who were similarly unreliable. And the net result is that by the end of his reign, by the end of Andronicus II's very, very, very long reign, the Byzantine Empire is kind of a wreck. And he tries to fix things by increasing taxation. The taxation provokes a civil war. And Andronicus II's grandson, whose name is Andronicus III, is actually the leader of the rebels. Eventually, the civil war is kind of averted by the death of Andronicus II in 1328. And his grandson Andronicus III succeeds him. So it's interesting. The situation in 1328 is ominous. And I think what it illustrates for us is that decision-making and leadership on the part of Byzantine emperors has a much bigger effect on the fortunes of the Byzantine state than anything that had been done a century earlier by the Fourth Crusade. These guys, especially Andronicus II, inherited vast resources and squandered them. Andronicus II was a thoroughly mediocre ruler. at a time when Byzantium really needed a star. Andronicus III, his grandson, was a little bit more of a star. He actually had some very important success, restoring the Byzantine state after 1328. Most importantly, he reconquered Epirus. He reconquered this area over here, in the Western Balkans. It was a very, very important victory. It won Andronicus III enormous prestige. In the minds of the Turks, in the minds of the Latins, and in the minds of his own subjects. He intimidated the Serbs and the Bulgars into submission. And he also began negotiating for church union. Now, this is where things get really, really dicey. For Andronicus III, the theological issues that separated the Latin Church from the Greek Church by the 14th century had gotten very, very complicated. Greek Orthodox polemics against Latin theology. It's a tradition that goes way back. It goes back to the time of Photius, and even beyond back to the time of the Kuniszeg's Council. So it's a very, very old tradition. But for our purposes here, what we see is that the more time goes by, the older the schism gets. The more the issues ramify, the more complicated the issues become. And so we see that here during Andronicus III's negotiation for church union. Andronicus III sent a delegate to talk to the Westerners, and also to talk to some Greek theologians about the issues that separate the Eastern and Western churches. And the delegate's name was Barlaam of Calabria. Barlaam of Calabria was, as his name suggests, he was a Greek speaker from the south of Italy, subject of the Byzantine Empire. Spiritually speaking, he was Byzantine. And he decides, okay, I can be the Byzantine representative at these negotiations, because I'm also from Italy. And I understand the West. Now, Barlaam of Calabria made the mistake of suggesting, during the course of some of these conversations, that it was really pointless to debate about the procession of the Holy Spirit. This is one of these old issues that separates the Latin and Greek churches. Ever since the Carolingian times, the papacy had endorsed the idea of adding the filioque to the creed, saying that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, and putting that in the liturgy. The Greeks, of course, had always resisted this, and it was one of the things that they found particularly galling about Western liturgical practice. And so, but throughout the Middle Ages, there had been various debates that dealt with a lot of issues. Not just the issue of putting it in the liturgy, but even the theology behind it. What the Greeks call triadology, the study of the Trinity. And Barlaam of Calabria made the mistake of saying, well, we really can't see God. We really can't know God in this life. And so, it's kind of pointless for us to be at each other's throats about the procession of the Holy Spirit. I mean, isn't that sort of silly? And this provoked a massive reaction from the Byzantine monastic clergy. Because the Byzantine monastic clergy believe that you can see God in this life if you pray properly. And the father of this type of spiritual mysticism is known as Gregory Palamas. Gregory Palamas, the great defender of hesychasm. What is hesychasm? Hesychasm is something I couldn't possibly do justice to in a few minutes up here. I couldn't possibly do justice to it if I had all day. And I think the reason I couldn't do justice to it is because I haven't prayed in the hesychast tradition. I think, with prayer and spirituality, it's dangerous to try to explain something that you haven't experienced yourself. So my ability to explain hesychasm is limited. But hesychasm, it was a monastic, ascetic, and mystical practice that had become traditional and mentathos on the holy mountain. And what it was basically the idea of attempting to achieve a kind of a union with God through repetitive prayer, specifically through the repetition of the prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, have mercy on me a sinner. And the monks believed that through the repetition of this prayer and through certain kinds of sensory deprivation, they could come in their mind's eye to see the light that surrounded the Holy Trinity. Now, why is this important in this context? It's important in this context because all of a sudden, hesychasm becomes a political issue. Hesychasm becomes a political issue in the Byzantine Empire, which ends up undermining Andronicus III. It ends up playing a major role in fueling Byzantine civil war in the 1340s. It ends up having a massive impact on the history of the 14th century Byzantine Empire. Because, as is always the case in Byzantium, religious orthodoxy is what matters more so than anything. And while you have emperors who are willing to make compromises and flirt with Westerners and dabble in heterodox things, the clergy are always going to be the defenders of orthodoxy as they see it. And so Gregory Palamas, the great defender of hesychasm, he said to Barlaam of Calabria, "You're wrong. It's not pointless to debate about the Holy Spirit. It's a good idea to debate about the Holy Spirit. And you're wrong that we don't know God because we do know God because we see God when we meditate. And if you don't see God, then you're not meditating right." And Barlaam of Calabria said, "Well, what do you mean? You see God. You see the Trinity?" And he said, "No. We see the light that surrounds the Trinity." And Gregory Palamas said, "This light is there." And Barlaam of Calabria said, "I don't know what you're talking about. There's 3 persons in the Trinity. There's a Father, there's a Son, and there's a Holy Spirit. What's the light?" And eventually, Barlaam of Calabria ends up accusing Gregory Palamas of believing in a 4th person of the Trinity. And this is partly true because the defenders of hesychasm, they tended to talk about the light as being uncreated. So if it's uncreated, is it God? And if it's not God, then how is it uncreated? It sounds kind of arcane. It sounds good. I mean, to us, to our ears, it might sound like an absurd debate. But it was a big deal because it was related to these ecumenical efforts of Andronicus III. And it was related to the notion of what it means to be an Orthodox Christian. So hesychasm becomes a live political football then in the 14th century Byzantine Empire. Any emperor, from this point on in the 14th century, any emperor who has attempted to seek church union with the West, to privilege alliances with the West, with the Genoese, or the Venetians, he's going to be opposed by other factions in the Byzantine Empire who can invoke the support of the hesychas. And that's the simplest way to put it, basically. It's not that these hesychastic monks were interested in taking power and using hesychasm to overthrow emperors. Rather, it's that hesychasm provides a kind of an impetus, a popular opinion, against flirting with Westerners politically. And this is something that's going to weaken the Byzantine Empire drastically. And this is especially the case during the horrible civil war that afflicted the Byzantine Empire between 1341 and 1347. 1341 is the year of Andronicus III's death. And this is a time when all this whole debate about hesychasm is just coming to the fore. It's just becoming a public thing at this time. And his successor, his son, John V, was only 9 years old. So a 9-year-old needs a regent. And this is what's going to lead to all sorts of trouble. John V's regent was this fellow here, John Cantacuzenus. So the 2 Johns would fight a bitter civil war from 1341 to 1347. During the course of this civil war, the only winners were the Turks, as you can imagine. This is a time when unity was never more important for the Byzantine Empire. Clarity of purpose was never more important for Byzantine emperors. And it's during this period that Byzantine political and military fortunes in the Aegean world are going to go into a steep decline. How does the civil war start? How do these things ever start? John Cantacuzenus, the regent, was out on campaign. While he was out on campaign, there was a little coup back home involving the patriarch, the emperor's mother, and one of the Grand Dukes. And the 3 of them formed a regency. And they actually got mobs together. They encouraged urban mobs in Constantinople to ransack the houses of supporters of the Cantacuzenus family and to ransack the houses of the Cantacuzenus family themselves. And so when this happened, of course, John Cantacuzene naturally recruits an army to come back and retake control of the capital. But where does he recruit the army from? He recruits Turks. He recruited Umar of Aydin, who is one of these emirs. Later on, John Cantacuzene would also recruit members of the Ottoman family to fight on his side as well. To keep it simple, basically, the civil war drags on for 6 years. And the regency in Constantinople, that coalition of the Patriarch, the Emperor's mother, the Grand Duke, and then the boy Emperor, John V. They have a very, very hard time hanging in there in a long war against an experienced commander like John Cantacuzene. Eventually, the Turks are taking advantage of the civil war. The Serbians are taking advantage of the civil war. And what makes things especially dicey for the regency is that the supporters of Gregory Palamas and the supporters of the Athonite monks and the supporters of Hesychasm all side with John Cantacuzene. And so the regency is finally weakened. The Cantacuzenites end up digging a tunnel under the walls of Constantinople, coming into the city. I have no idea how they did that, but that's what the sources say. I mean, maybe they dug a tunnel under a gate or something. If you've seen these walls, you can't dig under them. But they somehow tunneled into the city. And when they got in, nobody had the heart to fight them. The civil war ended in 1347. But the reconciliation of 1347, it's very much an uneasy one. And it creates a very, very weak empire, which then, as the two Johns ruled together from 1347 until 1354, with John Cantacuzene being the senior partner here, things just go from bad to worse. The obvious thing that happens in 1347 is what? Obvious. Westerns of 1347, what happens? Black Death. So Black Death takes a major toll on the Byzantine Empire. It actually takes a much more serious toll on the Byzantines than it does, say, on the Serbs or the Turks. And there are reasons for that. An empire that depends on tax revenue, an empire that depends on a monetized economy, an empire that has to pay in coin to its soldiers, is going to suffer more from something like the Black Death, because of what it does to the tax rolls. They're going to suffer more from it than these Turkish emirs who have an endless supply of recruits coming in from the Mongol Khanate. And so what happens is what the Byzantine Empire, by 1354, by the end of this dual rule by the coalition, the Byzantine Empire is a wreck. Things continue then to go from bad to worse. As these Turkish rulers, establish themselves in Western Europe, by the 1350s they were well established on the European side of the straits in Gallipolis. They were able to expand their nation Ottoman state across Thrace to actually fight battles against the Serbs and the Bulgars. Oh, that's a terrible map. This isn't showing. I'll skip that slide, because it's not really showing up. What that map was attempting to show was the fact that by 1385, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to a couple of cities, a couple of coastal cities, Constantinople, Thessalonica, and a few other enclaves. Thessalonica would fall in 1387. The Byzantine Empire, by this point, is in irreversible decline. In fact, by the time you get to the 1390s, no intelligent person in the 1390s would have imagined that the Byzantine Empire would have lasted as long as it did. And so, of course, who's going to fill the vacuum? It's obviously going to be the Turks. And eventually, what we'll find is that as the Turks surround Constantinople, advances in technology are going to make it so that these walls can no longer keep the Turks out. Artillery is going to play a part in this. And overwhelming numbers are going to play a part in this. By the 1390s, everybody would have felt that Constantinople was, in fact, doomed. So that's part 1. Part 2 will be next Sunday. Alright. So question and answer session. We always keep this short. So if you have a question, make sure that your question is 1 sentence long, that it has a question mark on the end, and that it has to do with the topic at hand. So about what he talked about tonight, if you're wanting to continue on into next week with his continuation, just hold that question until he gets there. And Dr. McGuire, just make sure that your answers are short enough that I can get in a couple questions if that's okay. Sounds good. Great. Who's got a question for me? I was surprised, but I gather that the Turks were not the native people in that area. Is that right? The way you were talking, it sounds like there were Turks. And then they started moving. So my Turks were some other people that weren't living in this area. Yeah. No, this is the problem in history, in general. You become the native people after a while. And I think that is true. In modern Turkey, the Turks weren't always there. It wasn't always Turkey. So Anatolia, what we call Asia Minor, it's an area that was, historically speaking, populated by a whole variety of different ethnicities, Isaurians, Frisians, all these different kinds of people. It became more homogeneous and more Greek after the Islamic conquests of the Near East. There were a lot of people who were relocated into Asia Minor and Anatolia, especially troops who were given land grants there and stuff like that. So Asia Minor becomes very much more Greek-speaking, and the Byzantine Empire as a whole becomes a smaller, leaner, meaner, more homogeneous thing in the 7th century. So yeah, the Turks themselves, it is one of these things. Talking about where people come from. I think one of the refreshing things about postmodernity is the realization that a lot of the ideas that we had about race in modern times are actually nonsense. In point of fact, people of diverse ethnicities are genetically sometimes very close to one another. And sometimes two Irish people could be genetically very different from one another. And really, the whole notion of race and bloodlines as it was understood in the 19th and 20th century is a really misleading thing. So there has to be that caveat when you talk about where people came from. Because when you talk about nomadic peoples, a lot of times it's like talking about George Washington's axe. We got 3 new handles and 5 new blades over the last 200 years. But it's the original axe. I don't know. What I mean by that is by the time people have migrated over the course of centuries across many different territories, you've had the amalgamation of different ethnicities and tribes and groups and things into them. Insofar as the Turks are a coherent people, they're Central Asian nomads who are recruited into the service of the Abbasid Caliphate, starting in the 9th century, and later became numerous enough and powerful enough to undermine the authority of the Abbasid caliphs, and then, of course, to threaten Byzantium. As far as Byzantine history is concerned, the key date is 1071, which is the Battle of Manzikert, when the Seljuk Turks kind of shattered the army of Romanos IV Diogenes, and were then able to settle in Anatolia. I propose the last question. The Turks were the Turks. But who were the Byzantines ethnically? Ethnically. Oh, see, that's an even more interesting question. That's a much more interesting question. Because during the 7th century, the Balkan Peninsula in Greece were settled very, very heavily by Slavs. And so this is why it gets dicey when you talk about ethnicity, right? Even later in the Middle Ages, even into the modern period, the Balkan Peninsula in Greece, you could argue, are heavily Slavic, even in areas where people spoke Greek. And so what does ethnicity mean at that point? It's hard to say. But basically, yeah, the Byzantines were the descendants of the various Greek, Slavic, Cappadocian, Isaurian, Phrygian peoples who had lived in that region for thousands and thousands of years. You got certain isolated Greek populations, like the Pontic Greeks around Trebizond, who were theoretically, the descendants of Greek colonists from the Archaic period. So say from the 7th or 6th century BC. And when they were moved by the Turkish Republic, when Ataturk kicked them out and sent them to Greece, they were told, "Oh, you're being shipped home." And this was very puzzling to them, because this was the only home that they had ever known, going back hundreds of years before Christ. So it's easy on the one hand to say, the Byzantines were Greek, ethnically. But we have to qualify that by saying that they're more ethnically diverse than that. And no good Byzantine ever would have called themselves a Greek, either, because the word Greek meant pagan. To say that you were a Helleno, or whatever, it meant that you were a pagan and that you worshipped Apollo. So they wouldn't have called themselves Greeks. The only people who used the term Greeks for Byzantines were Westerners, who called them Graecian, and Byzantine chroniclers who pretended to be Thucydides, and pretended to be Xenophon by writing an added Greek, and so that they would use the same terms that Thucydides or Xenophon would have used. And it's even kind of comical in the late Middle Ages, when you see Byzantine chroniclers, who they try to circumlocute around using a term like bishop, or something like that, because Xenophon didn't know what a bishop was or something. And it gets kind of odd when you get into that classicizing thing. But really the term Greek, it's not one that Byzantines themselves would have claimed. The Byzantines called themselves Romans. They were Romans, the Rome, and the Turks called them Rum and the Arabs called them Rum. And so when you had the first Seljuk Sultanate in Anatolia, it was called the Sultanate of Rum, which means rum, because they thought of it as Byzantine territory, and therefore Roman. There are a number of different groups on your chart. It would seem to me that they probably didn't trust one or another. Couldn't a dynamic or a dominant power sow enough discontent and hate and so forth in there to keep the others fighting each other? So they're taking pretty much do what they want? Yeah, no, that's a great idea. And to some extent, Manuel, the second Paleologus, later on tried to do that. But by that point, Byzantium had already been so weakened that it was kind of irreversible. I don't know that I saw a headline about irreversible climate change or something like that. That the Antarctic ice is now melting so fast that there's no possible way to stop it. Even if we went down there with 10,000 freezers and tried to stop it. But to some extent, that happens with Byzantium, where at a certain point, institutional decline, political and military decline and fiscal decline, it becomes, as it were, irreversible, because there no longer is a base for the Byzantine Empire to exist. In fact, the walls of Constantinople, those monumental fortifications, they give the empire a kind of an unnaturally long life. In this period, right? There's no way a normal city would have hung on until 1453 here. Hello, good evening. I have just, I guess, 2 questions. The first one's more of a confirmation. You did say that the anti-Union faction of the Byzantine, while it came to fruition during the once Constantinople, fell and the Turks basically took over. But it really began first amongst themselves, correct? Right. The division of Byzantine Christians into pro-Union and anti-Union factions. It really dates to the time of Michael VIII Paleologus, and the triumph of the anti-Unionist faction. The final triumph of the anti-Unionist faction. It is the Turkish conquest of the city. The Turks went and that they found Genodius Galerios, who was by far the most prolific anti-Latin polemicist. And they made him the Patriarch of Constantinople. And the Turks saw to it, part of their protection of the Byzantine Church was that they were heavily involved in selecting the Patriarch. And they sometimes executed patriarchs and things like that. And part of it was to promote that anti-Unionist theology among the Byzantines who were subject to them, because that was the one antidote against the Great Crusade that they feared coming from the West. Thank you. And just the second question was, who were the Illyrians during that time? Because I saw the map, and it really doesn't show the Illyrians, because most of the time, before the Serbs came into the Balkan Peninsula, most of the Orthodox churches were Illyrian Orthodox churches, which are now basically been taken over by the Serbs. During that time, I think Illyrian Orthodox Church would be an example of that kind of classicizing nomenclature. Illyrian, that would be an ancient term for that region. So Diocletian was Illyrian, theoretically. Diocletian and Maximandia and Galerius and all these guys were Illyrian. Illyricum in the United Empire is the crossroads of Latin and Greek culture, basically. So even a guy like Justinian was basically an Illyrian, in the sense that he was a native Latin speaker. Now, I'm not familiar with the idea of an Illyrian Orthodox Church, though. I'm just not familiar with that notion. I think, ethnically speaking, what you would have in the Balkan Peninsula generally there, and in what would have been Illyricum, is you would have the descendants of 7th century Slavic immigrants, basically, to that area. So various kinds of Slavs would have lived there. You would have had the Hungarian king, would have been a major political player in this area. So somebody like Sigismund I, the king of Hungary, had major ambitions in that region. The Venetians had ambitions there. And then certainly the Serbs and the Bulgars. And that extends into early modernity. Even when the Serbs and the Bulgars and people like that were vassals of the Turks, there still is this dream of a greater Serbian Empire, a greater Bulgarian Empire, or a greater Hungarian Empire, somehow incorporating that area. It is a cultural crossroads. We'll say that. But I'm not aware that there was a discrete ethnicity called Illyrians in this period.